Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Asian Religion series of Bright on Buddhism. In this series, we will be discussing religious traditions in Asia other than Buddhism. Buddhism has never existed in a vacuum, and as it has spread all across East Asia and the world, it has developed, localized, and syncretized with local traditions in fascinating and significant ways. As such, we cannot provide a complete picture of East Asian Buddhism without discussing these local traditions, such as they are and such as they were. Today, we will be continuing our discussion of Shinto, a very historically and culturally significant religious tradition in Japan. If you have not already, please listen to part 1 of our Asian Religion series episode on Shinto. We hope you enjoy. When we left our discussion last time, we had just introduced how Shinto, Buddhism, and the emperor were inseparably related in Japan throughout the Nara and Heian periods. We discussed how Shinto kami were regarded as being manifestations of Buddhas, and how the function of the emperor was to propagate Buddhism in the nation, serve as a living kami and a progenitor for the nation's people, and maintain the cosmological order, which included Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, regular people, kami, spirits, and more. He accomplished this through his administration of the realm, and if he failed in upholding any of these responsibilities, the result would be natural disasters, famines, epidemics, political unrest, wars, and foreign invasions. Even though the emperor's ideal role was to prevent those things, in reality, all of those things did happen throughout the Nara, Heian, and medieval periods of Japanese history. But that's beside the point. Given this complicated cosmology and its political connotations, and the fact that it's so centered around the emperor, there arose a political and religious ideology in Japan known as Shinkoku. Shin is the same Shin as in Shinto, meaning gods, and Koku means country, land, or realm. Thus, Shinkoku translates roughly to the land of the gods, and it's a way of describing the position of the Japanese emperor, the Japanese people, and the Japanese archipelago in the complex cosmology of Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, kami, and spirits that arose in these ancient and medieval periods. Japanese land was regarded as sacred and belonging to the Yamato people, and the Yamato people were regarded as holy people, and the imperial court was regarded as a holy institution. And these all existed in a sacred cosmology and a sacred geography. We've already described the sacred cosmology, and the sacred geography is Shinkoku. This Shinkoku geography developed and grew throughout the ancient and medieval periods, and it became ever more syncretic with Buddhism as it did so. Let's pick our discussion back up at the end of the Heian period, which was 1185. In 1180, a civil war broke out in Japan, which would later be called the Genpei Kassen, or the Genpei War. This war was fought between the rival Minamoto and Taira clans. Another way to read the character Minamoto is Gen, and another way to read the character for Taira is Pei or Hei, hence the title Genpei War, combining these two names. This war was the culmination of decades of conflict between the two clans, each one jockeying for dominance over the imperial court and thereby, and by extension, control of all of Japan. This is one of my favorite periods of Japanese history to study, and I encourage everybody to read about it. But for the sake of our discussion of Shinto, we will have to only mention that this was a civil war that ended the Heian period and resulted in a great loss of power for the Japanese imperial court. The court didn't disappear by any means, but a military government, known as a bakufu, was set up in modern-day Kamakura, a city about 2 hours south of Tokyo. This began the Kamakura period, which lasted from 1185 to 1333. During this time, Buddhism exerted a very strong influence on Japanese culture and society. It is in this period that we can find the origins of Japanese Zen, Pure Land, and Nichiren Buddhism. However, just because Buddhism came to dominate Japanese culture does not mean that Shinto was completely absent. In fact, it was an inseparable portion of Buddhism, as we've mentioned before. As such, Shinto rites continued and even flourished. One example of this is the Ise Shrine, which is dedicated to Amaterasu, the sun goddess and the ancestor of the Japanese imperial family. This shrine has been rebuilt every 20 years for much of its history. There are 2 plots of land right next to each other, and every 20 years, new cypress trees are cut down and processed to build the shrine on the vacant plot, and the kami body of Amaterasu, which is a bronze mirror, is transferred over from the old plot to the new plot. Then the old plot is deconstructed. As was mentioned, Shinto is deeply concerned with death pollution, and so as a result, if the shrine is not renewed and thus purified on a regular basis, then the power of the shrine decays. Rebuilding it is a means of recharging, reinvigorating, and purifying it. At the same time, it is also a practice of making regular offerings and showing continued commitment and devotion to the worship of Amaterasu. You can think of it as a way of saying that they haven't put her in a shrine out in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in the Mie prefecture, and forgotten about her. This rebuilding ceremony also includes the whole community. People and organizations from all over Japan contribute resources, labor, or money to the project, and they make a big festive show of it in various communities all over Japan. At a nearby shrine known as Izumo Shrine, which is dedicated to Okuni-nushi, there is another fascinating festival. In the 10th month of the traditional lunar calendar, a festival is held to welcome all the gods from all over Japan to the Izumo Grand Shrine. Every shrine in Japan ritualistically removes the kami body that is enshrined there, covers it up so that it is not seen by everybody and therefore polluted, and then they transport it in a secret or covered vehicle overnight to Izumo, which is in the Shimane prefecture, in the southwest of Japan. The purpose of this is to have a family reunion among the kami. The kami come to visit Okuni-nushi, and they're said to discuss the coming year's marriages, deaths, and births. This festival is called Kami Arizuki, the month with gods. In Izumo, and in the rest of Japan, they call it Kannazuki, the month without gods. Something else that's important to note is that Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines were often built in close proximity to each other. Because of that, a huge proportion of Japanese Buddhist temples will simultaneously house a Shinto shrine on the property as well. Additionally, their ritual programs will usually include rituals which are dedicated to each of the deities enshrined there, the Buddha in the temple and the kami in the shrine. A good example of this is a site known as Kumano, a shrine complex in Wakayama Prefecture, which is in the very far south of Japan. This site is very significant for both Buddhism and Shinto. It is situated at the foot of a waterfall called Nachi Falls, one of the most famous waterfalls in all of Japan. As such, it houses 2 Buddhist temples and an accompanying shrine. This site is the site of a pilgrimage, and one of the rituals that's carried out there is the Kumano Fire Festival. During this festival, which takes place annually in July, the 12 kami enshrined at the Kumano shrine are taken to commune with the Nachi waterfall as a means of reenacting the kami's original enshrinement and, again, as a way to recharge and refresh the kami. This festival is called the Fire Festival because as the kami bodies are being transported along the very dangerous and treacherous trail to the waterfall, the attendants of the shrine must purify the path in front of the kami with these big 50-pound bamboo barrels which are lit on fire. Rituals like these occurred in tandem with Buddhist rituals, and thus the term Shinbutsu Shugo has come to define the era. The symbol Shin is the same as Shinto, and the Butsu is Buddha, or Buddhism, and Shugo means syncretism, or religious practices that mix and combine. There's another syncretic tradition that originates in Japan that also combines Shinto and Buddhist practices, and it is called Shugendo. The name Shugendo translates roughly to the way of trial practice. This is a name applied to a corpus of ascetic practices that syncretizes Shinto and Buddhist doctrine and that are centered around holy mountains. As you remember, the geography of Japan is regarded as holy in the Shinkoku ideology, and as such, the practices of Shugendo are about making offerings to deities in or on the mountains, practicing the austerities on the mountains, and holding rituals on the mountains. We won't get into too much detail about this tradition today, but we should mention that it co-evolved with Shinto and Buddhism all throughout ancient and medieval Japanese history. Having mentioned it, however, we're primed to talk about the significance of Mount Fuji. This is probably one of the most well-known mountains in the world. It has become a symbolic representation of Japan itself. It is everywhere in popular culture today, and it has played a very important role in Japanese history and culture. Mount Fuji is an active volcano located southwest of Tokyo in Shizuoka Prefecture, and it's even visible on clear days from Tokyo and Yokohama. It comes up constantly in the classical literature of Japan, going all the way back to the Heian period, and it has always represented a place of pleasure, but also of fear. It is thought to be animated by a kami, but also by Buddhas, and it's also very important in Shugendo practice. Fuji is mentioned in the Nihon Shoki, one of the 2 historical chronicles that I mentioned last episode. In it, it is said that the goddess Konohana Sakuya Hime, the wife of Ninigi, is the goddess of Mount Fuji, and the Fujisan Hongu Sengen Taisha is a shrine which is dedicated to her. Historically, people were afraid to climb the mountain or get too close, and so they would perform rites from afar to prevent eruptions. However, after several centuries of inactivity, people got closer and closer to the mountain. Shugendo made it a center of practice, and there was even a shrine founded on the summit in the 12th century. Since the 1600s, there has been a cult of worship around Mount Fuji, which has revolved around making offerings, climbing the mountain, and doing rituals to forestall eruptions. This cult is called Fujiko, and it worships the mountain as a female goddess. We should mention that when we say cult, we mean it in a very broad sense. Cult is a loaded word in the English language because it has this very scary and malicious connotation. In the English language discourse, cult is kind of even a dirty word because of the existence of these very evil organizations such as Scientology, Mormonism, Heaven's Gate, and more. But the word itself simply refers to a small group which is unified by religious practice centered around a single figure. By definition, their group is small, because if it was large, we would call it a religion, and their practice is somewhat divergent from the mainstream. It exists within an existing religious tradition, and their practice does not worship the main deity of that tradition or any of the regular main deities of that tradition. They actually focus on another figure, and their divergent practice takes a different form than the regular religious practice of that existing tradition. In this case, in a cult, either the object of worship is a minor figure in another religious tradition, or their ritual practice is not the same as other traditions. That doesn't necessarily mean the practices are bad or evil, but they are different. For more on this, see our episode on Buddhist cults. In addition to having been called a cult, Fujiko has also been called a confraternity because it's made up of lay people who are unified by their practice of climbing the mountain. Fuji last erupted in 1707 in what is known as the Hoei eruption. During this eruption, the east side of the mountain blew up and cast volcanic ash all the way to the Boso Peninsula and beyond. The Boso Peninsula is where modern-day Chiba Prefecture is. It's a few hours east of Tokyo. To this day, there's still a crater on the eastern side of the mountain where it erupted. As such, the magic and the terror of the mountain has captured imaginations in Japan and around the world for centuries. Back to our discussion of Shinto, we should note that there are some changes and innovations in Shinto between the Kamakura and the early modern periods, but remember that Buddhism was the main show during that time, so there's not much to talk about. That being the case, we're going to jump from the Kamakura period over to the Muromachi period, which took place from 1333 to 1568, and into the Azuchi Momoyama period, which took place from 1568 to 1600. This period of history is known as the Sengoku period. Sen is the same sen as in Genpei Kassen, which means war, and Goku or Koku is the same as in Shinkoku, meaning country, realm, or land. Thus, this period is called the Warring States period of Japanese history. During this time, the country was broken up into small realms ruled by samurai warlords who were all jockeying with each other for dominance. Because of the war and the bloodshed that took place during this time, religious innovations are put on the back burner. This period came to an end as Toyotomi Hideyoshi unified the country in 1590. We should note that this does not include Hokkaido, the northernmost island and prefecture of Japan. It also doesn't include Okinawa. Those regions were not officially part of the Japanese nation until the 1870s, and they're actually colonized regions. Before the Yamato Japanese expanded their borders northward, the indigenous ethnic group, which existed in Hokkaido and in the northern regions of Honshu, the biggest island of Japan, is called Ainu. They have a very different culture, language, and history from southern Japanese people. Back to the story at hand, Japan's various provinces were unified under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, but then soon after, the Tokugawa family, led by Tokugawa Ieyasu, became the shogun, or the leader of the military government, the bakufu I mentioned earlier. I'm speeding through this history really fast and skipping a lot of important information, but I encourage everybody to look it up and learn more because it's a super fascinating period. What I'm building up to for the purposes of this show is what is known as the Edo period, which lasted from 1600 to 1868. This period is so called because the Tokugawa shogunate moved the capital of the bakufu government to Edo, which is modern-day Tokyo. This is the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the early modern period. The Tokugawa shogunate was strongly influenced by Confucian styles of government that they observed in China, and as such, they crafted a regime of legalistically enforced peace and stability. There were a few uprisings here and there, but no major wars, invasions, or regime changes. This legalism took a number of forms. At the higher echelons of international power, Japan implemented what is known as sakoku, or a policy which only allowed governmentally approved trade and commerce through 4 major gateways. Japan traded with China and the Dutch through the port of Nagasaki. The northern Japanese Matsumae clan traded with the Ainu in the north at the Oshima Peninsula. Korean trade took place on the island of Tsushima, and the Ryukyu kingdom to the south were traded with through the Satsuma domain. It should be noted here that sakoku does not necessarily mean that all borders were completely and totally closed and no interaction with foreigners took place. It only meant that all trade and interactions with foreigners happened through these governmentally regulated ports, these 4 ports I just mentioned. Additionally, it also meant that entering and leaving Japan was regulated by the government. This isn't so different from how contemporary nations handled their immigration. Within the country, all major daimyo clans, or samurai lord clans, were obligated to spend a year in Edo instead of in their own domain, during which time they would directly serve the shogun. This had the dual result of financially controlling the daimyo clans as well as keeping them on the move essentially all the time. In the lower realms of power, sumptuary laws became extremely prevalent. Sumptuary rules are rules that regulate consumption, whether it is the consumption of goods or the consumption of ideas. Some examples of sumptuary laws were that people had to belong to a samurai clan to carry swords. Anything threatening to the Tokugawa government could not be printed or represented in art, and people had rules as to imagery and patterns that they could and could not wear on their clothes. In the realm of religion, there were some very interesting things going on during the Edo period. Christianity had arrived in Japan in 1549 by way of the Portuguese Jesuit missionaries. They were initially allowed to carry out their missionary activities with no problem, but soon after their arrival, missionary activities were banned due to the fact that they were imperialistic threats from European colonial powers. This and further laws oppressing Christians contributed to a rebellion in the early 1600s known as the Shimabara Rebellion. In response to this, the Tokugawa shogunate outlawed Christianity outright and declared that all Japanese people would be required to register with their neighborhood Buddhist temple. This edict had many functions. In part, it served as a census, but it also served to financially starve Buddhist temples, because now they had to fulfill ritual functions for far more people than before, and it also rooted out secret Christians. Now, why would the shogunate want to financially starve Buddhist institutions? The answer is that it was because Buddhism was losing its influence and popularity in Edo culture and society. It was being critiqued and regarded as being foreign, archaic, obsolete, and not suited to the metropolitan and modern world. Thus, its popularity was being eclipsed. And what was it being eclipsed by? Well, it was being eclipsed by a resurgent popularity in Shinto. It was during this time that the idea that Shinto was the indigenous religion of Japan and of the Japanese people came back into the cultural discourse. Shinto was also increasingly popular with the Tokugawa shoguns, who were themselves deified into kami after their deaths and were enshrined at some of the most famous holy sites in Japan. The first Japanese shogun is enshrined and entombed at Nikko Toshogu Shrine in Tochigi Prefecture. It is almost due north of Tokyo, and it can be reached in about 2 hours by bus, and it's one of the most ornately decorated shrines in all of the world. After his death, Tokugawa Ieyasu was declared by the emperor to be a kami known as the Tosho Daigongen, which translates to the avatar of the Great Eastern Light. The emperor is the only living person who can deem people kami after their deaths because he himself is a kami, and Tokugawa was named as one in recognition for his highly decorated and historically transformative career. Subsequent shoguns were also deified in a similar fashion. Now you might be asking, why was there such a resurgence in the popularity of Shinto during the Edo period, and why had Buddhism sort of fallen out of favor? Well, the answer is that during this Tokugawa period, there was a lot of focus put onto trying to understand and dig out the roots of Japanese culture and Japaneseness. And in doing this, they returned to a lot of the classical literature that was famous and popular throughout the Heian periods and the Nara periods and so on, They went back to a lot of the famous works that came out during those times, like the Tale of Genji, and they also went back to the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki. In so doing, they were looking for what it meant to be Japanese and what the roots and origins and significance of Japanese culture was. In doing so, these trends in Shinto thought that we've discussed so far came back into the cultural discourse in a very significant way, and so Shinto started to become more important to everyday people than Buddhism. During the Edo period, the influence of Japanese Confucianism was also very strong. Now you must be thinking, Confucianism is from China, not from Japan. How did they let you have a master's degree? Well, the answer is that when I say Japanese Confucianism, I refer to Japanese scholars' interpretations of Confucian writings and the influence those interpretations had over political and social life during the Edo period. Primarily, I want to mention that although Confucianism comes from China, the interpretations that Edo period scholars make argue for this cultural mindset of nativism, wherein they search for what is essentially Japanese about Japanese culture, like I mentioned just a second ago. They attempt to search for, propagate, and construct what Japaneseness is. The scholarly trend that I'm talking about here is called kokugaku. Koku is country, realm, or land, and gaku means learning, study, or research. As such, kokugaku means country research, or nativist studies. It is in this trend of scholarship that the classical Japanese canon of literature is reread and is studied and is constructed and cemented in a way that it had not been before. The Heian period, which you remember lasted from 794 to 1185, became this nostalgic golden age of literary and artistic sensitivity, emotional attunement, spiritual consciousness, and courtly prestige. Thus, literature that was authored during this period, that I mentioned before, such as the Tale of Genji, but also the Tale of Heikei, collections of court poetry, the Pillow Book, Tales of Times Now Past, and so on, came to be seen as containing that which is essential to Japanese culture. Additionally, as I mentioned, scholars began to look on the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki as identifying the roots and origins of Japaneseness. As such, Shinto as it is presented in these texts has a resurgence, and this resurgence comes to be a movement called Neo-Shintoism, or Neo-Shinto thought. You should be thinking now that the Shinto that is presented in the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki is not the only Shinto. If we rewind back to the Nara period, when these were authored, we can see that Shinto as it is presented in the text is an invention, or rather a synthesis, which is aimed at legitimizing imperial rule. The text is not a record of what everybody in Japan believed at the time. Rather, the deities in the text can be thought of as being embellished amalgams who were assembled into this myth history that centers around the divinity and the legitimacy of the emperor. I have no doubt that Amaterasu existed and was worshipped somewhere in Japan before the authorship of the texts, but it's highly unlikely that anybody in the far north or far south of Japan knew who she was, and it was certainly not until the authorship of the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki that she became so closely associated with the emperor. So, in the late Edo period, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, this Neo-Shinto movement becomes increasingly popular, and the Tokugawa shogunate is wavering for a number of reasons that we need not get into here. And this increased popularity of Shinto is undermining the shogunate on another front, because it's a very pro-imperial narrative, and the existence of the Tokugawa shogunate has more or less been predicated on the emperor having decreased influence. As a result, this resurgent pro-imperial narrative feeds into the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate and the Meiji Restoration in the mid-19th century. The restoration is so called because they were restoring the power of government of Japan to the emperor, who was named Meiji at the time. This ended nearly 270 years of Tokugawa rule and nearly 230 years of tightly closed borders and legalistically regulated trade, politics, and sumptuary law. When we pick up our discussion next time, we're going to discuss how Shinto played a role in Japanese empire and colonialism during the 19th and 20th centuries. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Asian Religion series, Shinto Part 2. We have just left the story at the Meiji Restoration, and I hope that you will join us next time for Shinto Part 3, where we will pick up our story with developments in Shinto during the 19th and 20th centuries. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
and this has meant Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.